Welcome to another podcast.
Welcome to another episode of the Charlie and Andre podcast. You may be wondering why I'm wearing this whole number. That is because we're doing a podcast on the Balkan Wars. I'm wearing traditional Romanian garb, like a shirt just for the occasion. I don't know, just having a little fun here. Um, and yeah, we both have a lot to say about this, but I guess we should first start like some background, why it's important. One of the reasons why it's important is because this happened in 1912 and 1913, shortly before World War One, and it was one of the precursor conflicts to that probably caused it contributed to the outbreak of the war in a big way, which we will get into in detail a little later. Um, but I guess first to set some background for you. I mean, heck, you can go all the way back to like the Crimean War in the mid 1800s. In the 1850s, you had the Eastern Question. The so-called sick man of Europe was the name given by the Western European powers to the Ottoman Empire because it was slowly kind of collapsing and falling apart and retreating from Europe. So they saw that Russia was rising as a power uh, in the Black Sea region, and its power was growing relative to the Ottomans. So they wanted to help the Turks by actually fighting for them. So England and France with the Ottomans against Russia, despite, the Christianity and Islam. So this was like a geopolitical thing that caused Russia to kind of partially retreat from the area for a while. It had previously tried to make some inroads in the Danubian principalities. Um, then the next big conflict in the area came in 1877 and 78 with the war known as the Russo-Turkish War. Um, this was Russia actually pretty soundly defeating the Ottomans in the Balkans. Um, they gained influence in the region, and it actually led to the independence of Romania in 1877 from the Ottomans. Um, and Serbia, in part, also gained independence around this time. Uh, Greece, of course, had actually gained independence as far back as what 1821, I believe.
Yeah, it started in the 1820s, and then by the late 1820s, they were recognized by the major European
Right.
powers. Yeah.
And of course, at the time, they didn't have all the territory that they do today. It was only like a smaller
Mhm.
part around the core, like Athens in that area. But um, yeah, the Ottomans still had a lot of territory in Europe and the Balkans. But there was this kind of rise of nationalism, which is part of a greater wave of nationalism in Europe. Um, So all these different ethnicities, you had the Albanians, the Bulgarians, Serbs, Macedonians, Greeks in Europe. In the East, you had the Arabs, the Kurds, uh, eh, and various other peoples are starting to kind of clamor for their own um, for more independence or at least representation within the Ottoman Empire. Um, So I think in 1908 you had the Young Turk Revolution, which
Mhm.
seemed to kind of bring about a series of liberal reforms with the Ottomans, but it quickly devolved into like persecution of various ethnic minorities within the empire and the rise of Turkish nationalism, which of course became problematic. Um, but this kind of environment, was um, fertile ground for the emergence of Balkan nationalism. Also, another key factor is in 1911, a year before the war, you had the Italian Turkish War, in which the Italians defeated the Turks and captured Libya in North Africa from them. Um, and interestingly, this was one of the first wars in which air combat was part of it. They did reconnaissance and dropped some like bombs and stuff like that. But the key point is that it showed that the Turks were not invincible and that they were kind of falling apart and barely able to manage themselves. So because the Western powers weren't doing a lot to implement the reforms that the Balkan peoples were promised, the Balkan peoples took it upon themselves to fight off the Turks because they saw an opportunity. So they formed this league, Bulgaria, Greece, Serbia, um,
Montenegro.
Montenegro, yeah, which is associated with Serbia. But they, so yeah, that kicked off the first Balkan War against the Ottomans, and essentially made them independent states and kicked the Ottomans out of most of Europe. The land they called Rumelia, which is
Mm.
actually it goes back to like the Rum, which is like the land of the Romans, the Byzantines. But
Yeah, it's interesting to note, just as a interesting side note, with respect to nationalism and everything, the Greeks who fought in the Greek War of Independence in the 1820s, they didn't really consider themselves Hellenes. They thought that, I mean, as I understand it, they thought that was sort of an insult to say that you were a pagan. They were aware, of course, that like these ancient monuments and ruins were around like the areas that they lived, but they call themselves Rums. They would say, "I'm
right.
a Rum." So like the George Washington, so to speak, of the Greek Revolution is Theodoros Kolokotronis, and he considered himself like a rum. And when Lord Byron interacts with him, he says, "Oh, great Helen," speaking to him kind of in this ancient Greek dialect with a British accent, and they were just like flabbergasted that this guy is addressing them as a Helen. They're like, "No, we're rum people." The room and like you said, like the Ottomans considered these people like the room, the like the province of the Rum and Romelia.
Yeah, it was like an old holdover from, when they first started to capture that part of Europe,
Yeah.
like
And
Thrace and
indeed,
whatnot.
I mean, that goes back to other podcasts we've done. Like the Byzantines considered, they never called themselves the Byzantines. They called themselves the Romans.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, it's an interesting background there. So yeah, the first Balkan War happens, and then as a result of that, Serbia actually gained Macedonia, which Bulgaria was pissed off about. So basically, they, as part of their campaign for irredentism, they uh, started another war just a few weeks after the end of the first one, um, because so their alliance kind of fell apart because they were squabbling over territorial disputes after their independence. Um, and so Bulgaria actually became like sort of the aggressor in then the Second Balkan War, and all these other countries were fighting against it. Um, Eventually, it even took the entrance of Romania because they were kind of worried about the instability there, and also saw it as an opportunity to try to take part of the region of Dobruja along the Black Sea coast from Bulgaria, which they did. They invaded with like 80,000 men, and eventually this coalition defeated the Bulgarians, and the Treaty of Bucharest was signed in 1913, which kind of ceded that part of Dobruja to Romania, and um, yeah, Serbia held on to Macedonia for the time being. This kind of goes into the whole like Macedonian question because some people say Macedonians, like the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, is basically like Bulgarians, ethnic Bulgarians with a slightly special identity because they speak essentially a very similar language. But that's a whole nother thing.
Hmm.
But yeah, I mean, and you might wonder how Bulgaria, of all places, which is a relatively small country, was able to muster the power to, to mobilize all these troops. But they had their own kind of nationalism going on. They had a significant agrarian economy. Um, a lot of men were conscripted into the military at the time, and Yeah, they actually put up a decent fight for a few months, but eventually they were beaten. And of course, finally, the result of all this is like the rise of more Serbian nationalism, a larger Serbia, which kind of worried the Austro-Hungarians, which were kind of the big player on the bloc historically, but they themselves were also slowly decaying. Um, and then, of course, this led in part to like the situation with Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the assassination in Sarajevo in Bosnia by the Serb Gavrilo Princip. Supposedly, it was a powder keg that kicked off the war, but in reality, it was actually a lot more complex than just that, which I guess we can kind of uh, delve into now if you want, Charlie.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's fascinating that, like, I mean, usually when at least when you're in high school or something or in college, you talk about like the beginning of the war is like the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and it's interesting to consider that like there was a series of events that you just laid out that kind of led to that. It's like why was the Black Hand so upset? Why was Serbian
Backhand,
nationalism?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. And I was reading a couple of books. I was reading Eric Hobsbawm's The Age of Revolution, 1789 to 1848, that kind of talks about this lead up to the Balkan Wars. And he has a whole section on the Balkans and the rise of nationalism. And I mean, just a brief summary of the book. He says there's these dual revolutions going on from 1789 to 1848. It's the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution, which obviously has all these sweeping political, social, economic transformation of Europe and the world, like the United States as well. But
right, right,
another thing is, as an outcrop of Romanticism, you have this idea of nationalism coming about as a political force. And like when I mentioned about the Rum and the Clefts and Theodoros Kolokotronis, all the Greek revolutionary leaders, they didn't really have like this a sense of modern nationalism that we're aware of. They just saw them. I mean, they saw themselves as a common identity, but they didn't really see themselves as that way. This idea of like printing and like the Grimm's fairy tales, codifying all these folk tales and then them being communicated. It certainly was going on in Serbia. There was massive printing going on in Romania, and like this could be distributed to like the intellectual uh elite, and then that can so it's like the stories from agrarian society being transmitted to the intellectual elite, so you kind of have this back and forth of cultural ideas giving rise to nationalism and therefore making it a political force. um and so you have like the collapse of these aristocratic orders, both in the Ottoman Empire for sure, and the Habsburg empires, and you have these liberal nationalist identities. And then so the implications for the Balkans is that it spreads these revolutionary ideas. It starts off in Greece in like 1821. And the problem is that goes against the Concert of Vienna of 1815, that Metternich and Castlereagh and all those present were really worried. They're like, well, we don't really want Greece to be independent, but we also aren't allies exactly with the Ottoman Empire. Uh, but okay, the best example is Britain was initially against it. They become neutral and then they become pro it, as long as they can contain the situation. Like you said, make sure Greece is a small little country that they can control. Initially, it was a republic, but then once the president was assassinated, they installed a Bavarian prince. But that's just one representation of the idea of the nation state that's replacing empires. So this idea of polities is evolving as time goes on. And of course, by the time you get to Woodrow Wilson, he's been studying these events that have been going on in the Balkans and throughout Europe, and he thinks that every nation should have its own establishment. And certainly that I think that is a direct result of him also studying the Balkan Wars, which he was definitely focused on as
oh
he's
yeah, yeah, for sure.
marching up to his presidency in the United States to lead the U.S. into World War One. Um, so Hobsbawm, returning back to that book, he interprets the Balkan Wars as the result of this revolutionary nationalism that's ignited way earlier and weaponized with militarism. So he's of course interpreting this from like the lens of class struggle and things like that. But another author I was reading was Neil Ferguson, and he's talking about this War of the World. I read a number of his shorter articles as well, where he talks about Ferguson is known as a financial historian, and he's talking about how the financial markets were very good at predicting wars. That people could almost predict like the Franco. German War, Franco-Prussian
The
War of
Franco-Prussian
18.
War,
Yeah,
1871. Yeah.
yeah. And they predicted the Napoleonic Wars with accuracy, but he says that the Balkan Wars were the major prelude to the global violence of like the 20th century. And
Right.
again, he agrees with Hobsbawm that you have like this ethnic nationalism and this imperial decline, making the Balkans kind of this powder keg. But the bond markets in all over Western Europe didn't really pay attention to these events, which in retrospect, like you laid out, they totally should have because the whole region was becoming destabilized. They couldn't even control, the major powers couldn't control Bulgaria. It's intensifying Serbian nationalism, and it sets this stage for this assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So as these empires are declining, and you have this rise of these ethnic identities, and the bond market isn't recognizing at all. The bond markets, he said that the bond markets would fluctuate, correlate exactly to how military tensions went up. And he said they only started doing that after Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated. And he said by that time it was too late because the cogs of war were in motion for World War One.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to compare kind of the financial history, but also the class struggle history of that, kind of led and was a result of the Balkan Wars.
Right. Exactly. I mean, so as you can see, there's like much deeper causes to this global conflict than just something between, largely uh, Germany and France and whatnot. And then, the of course everybody cites the tangled like alliance system. Um, we're getting another call. I gotta ignore that. So so yeah, what the question is, so like, what does this say about like more modern situations, or at least like what was the impact on like the remainder of the 20th century, like the kind of lines drawn and other conflicts? For example, you have like the Yugoslav wars infamously in the 90s as a result of, the breakup of a country that some people say should not have really been together. Um,
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's so much to say because ultimately this region, most of it, I don't know if it was most of it, but like half of it certainly became Yugoslavia. And I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, the problem is, I guess they were united under this idea of like Marxist communism with like Tito, Marshal Tito, and everything. But
right.
I think what was shown in the 1990s is that was all artificial, and all these things were simmering
Yeah.
underneath once
Which
it.
Tito, he admittedly did do a really good job at keeping them together, and largely those tensions were kept kind of under the surface. Maybe they were kind of simmering, uh, but I mean, I guess you can trace it going back further to like around this time or the late 19th century, and that the Russians, they wanted an in to the region, so they promoted pan-Slavism, with like the,
Mhm.
the the Yugoslavs, the Serbs, the Bulgarians, I guess like the Croats, the Slovenes, the Bosnians, and all that. So the idea was already fueled, for a while, like the South Slavs, would have this. But interestingly, despite the Serbs and Croats speaking essentially the same language, because of religious differences and certain cultural fault lines and things like that, they were at each other's throats for, a lot of their history, sadly. And one wonders if things were handled better in the early 20th century, like around the time of the breakup and dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, if that those kind of things could have been maybe avoided. So it's something to think about.
I agree with you. It's something to think about. It's hard to conceive how that could have necessarily happened because I mean, I don't think like if Britain and France and Russia were very worried about these countries sort of getting out of control. I mean, I agree with you that there was pan-Slavism, which is sort of that a growth of or at least it's inspired by romantic nationalism as it was developing in the early 1800s. Um, and it just seems like the British, the French, and the Russians were kind of they had these balancing powers. I don't think they necessarily wanted to align with the Ottoman Empire. But they saw it as Britain saw the Ottomans as a buffer against the Russians. The Russians certainly for centuries wanted to take the whole, the glorious port of Constantinople. Um, and I mean, I think Britain would have seen that as a major threat to imperial power. And likewise, France and Russia would play this game that they were the protector of the Christians within the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah.
Um, and of course, there's always a question, did they really care? Like, was this really a humanitarian mission that they were carrying out, or did they really just want to expand
Yeah.
economic and political power?
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, so I think it's a mixture of both. Like they're trying to use nationalism, toward, a more practical geopolitical end in a lot of ways. And that's, people are kind of riled up and I don't know if I'd use the word manipulated, but it was somewhat orchestrated. But yeah, it goes to show you that all these kind of movements. I mean, after the end of World War One, you also had the emergence of Czechoslovakia, which is another
Mhm.
Slavic country that emerged out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Hungary becoming independent. Um, Romania gained a big chunk of territory from Hungary after the war, which kind of completed its main territory, like in Transylvania. Um, so, I mean, I guess the roots of this nationalism do ultimately go back in some ways to like the Greek Revolution, like that was the one
Mhm.
that like one of the first ethnic um kind of nationalist revolutions. Like the American one was not so much that, and the French one was not so much that. It was
Yes.
more like economic.
Eric Hobsbawm, yeah, th that book I was reading, Eric Hobsbawm, he says that basically the Greek Revolution is the first ethnic revolution because the American and French revolutions, they were united by ideals and indeed they were sort of a homogenous population, but it wasn't necessarily rounded around that idea of like identity necessarily. It was more
Yeah,
about like political and
right,
ideological identity.
exactly. So
Um,
yeah, it kind of
yeah.
it kicked off this sort of powder keg, this like chain, like a domino effect of other countries also clamoring for independence, irredentism, and completing their borders, uniting with their other peoples. Yeah, one you could debate whether or not that was a good thing or bad thing. I mean, having every little ethnic minority within a bigger empire have its own territory that can in some cases be a recipe for great instability and disaster. Imagine if that happened to all the different places in Russia,
Yeah.
Yeah, it would.
Well, I mean, it happened in the 1990s and it
Right,
was
I know
really
that
bad.
was one
And
of the
I
big,
mean,
but
in Yugoslavia, actually,
there's still a lot more in Russia, but I guess they're not very populous like out there in Siberia
yeah.
and stuff. But anyway, yeah, come back to Europe. Yeah, so these were important kind of movements. In Romania, yeah, they asserted their identity kind of based on unique language and culture in the region. They had a king of actually German origin, Carol the First, who was actually a very good king. Actually, almost all the kings of these European countries, these new countries, were of German origin in some way, including I think the king of Greece,
Yes.
um, and Bulgaria and other places. But yeah, that King Carol, he did well for the country. He rapidly industrialized them in the late 1800s over his pretty long reign. And by his death in 1914, he had, made the country relatively successful in the area. They had access to oil and other natural resources, just started to build a fleet and an army and air force and modernize, um, as did other countries in the region. So this Balkan War was actually an important kind of almost like a test or an experiment for the kinds of combat that would happen later. Obviously during the Great War itself, but during other various ethnic conflicts in the early 20th century. Um, so
It's interesting. We had talked about there was like a large anti-Habsburg sentiment, and there was also a large anti-Ottoman sentiment. I mean, that was kind of the impetus for the first Balkan War, where they were kind of pushing the Ottomans substantially out of Europe. Uh, I mean, it's interesting. The Habsburgs basically don't exist at all in any capacity. Like, where the remnants are like Austria,
Well,
basically.
like it, you mean like today or?
Yeah, I mean, like the Habsburg Empire doesn't exist, but
Oh,
I
well,
mean, in
no,
some
no, no.
but in some sense, I guess like the remnants of the Ottoman Empire were reconstituted as modern Turkey, and you can't really say that the remnants of the Habsburg Empire were really constituted into Yugoslavia.
Wait, but yeah, but I mean, I guess the core of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was well, Austria, right?
Right, right.
Just like Turkey was the core of the Ottoman Empire, um, but I don't think any of there was any political continuation from the people who ruled during
The
the the monarchies to the
No, I don't think
yeah,
so.
so
They were just broken up completely.
right.
But yeah, I mean, I think that the Serbians were just as anti-Habsburg as they were anti-Ottoman. In other words, is what I was trying to say.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because
Yeah.
they were concerned. In fact, yeah, the Habsburgs are maybe a more pressing problem, but they had to get the Turks out of the way first because they were showing more signs of, I guess, vulnerability and stuff at the time. So,
It's an interesting region because especially at that time, I mean, it's very rural and it's very mountainous. And I mean, it's just hard to get around there. And I guess it's been a perpetual thing ever since like, ancient times. It's just hard to get through that mountainous region. Um, so I think it led to a lot of these, cultures being kind of separated from the developments going on in Western Europe. I mean, you even get this, articulated in fiction, the 1897 novel Dracula. Like I think he starts off by leaving Budapest and then the train ends somewhere in Romania, right? And then he has to
mm.
travel by horse because, there's no train that goes into Romania at that time in history. So it's just a representation of like the further you get away from Western Europe, the less industrialized these regions are.
I don't know if that's entirely accurate. I think there was rail in Romania at that time. It wasn't like very extensive or well developed, but uh, certainly.
Was there, I mean, I guess maybe we don't know the answer off the top of our head, but if you were going into rural Transylvania, was there a rail from like
Oh,
Budapest
no,
to, yeah, yeah.
not particularly. Yeah, not rural, but I think it went through like the major
Yeah,
uh
if you were going to Bucharest,
yeah,
yeah.
or, other yeah. Because I've seen actually like there's interesting footage of like a parade procession from 1897 in Romania that the king was putting on, and it's interesting. They seem to be fairly well kind of developed for the time anyway, because like I said, that king had invested a lot into infrastructure and development and industry, but yeah, I mean, what else? What else? Anything else that we should mention?
I mean, I think just a point we wanted to make is that the Balkan Wars are a representation of maybe a lot of, maybe not necessarily missed, but history that isn't discussed as much with
It's a little
respect
more
to what,
obscure, yeah.
yeah, than what to the major events of World War One. Like I would contend this was a major factor that led to the political instability of World War One. Of course, it's not the only. Like you said,
Yeah,
there were like the secret alliances. There was the military buildup. There was the revanchist ideas
right.
after the Franco-Prussian War, and
And
also
some would argue that like the war would have happened one way or another, regardless, some way, right? Like,
yeah.
if it wasn't here, it would have been somewhere else. It would have been some other thing because kind of slowly building up toward that. But
And,
I
and
agree.
and
This region's very overlooked, so I agree with your point.
Yeah, and another thing you had mentioned earlier, like what can we glean from this about maybe what this means for the world in the future? And one interesting thing is, you go back to Thucydides talking about the Peloponnesian War. One of his main contentions is that it wasn't the inevitable, there was an inevitable clash between Athens and Sparta, but it didn't get ignited by Athens and Sparta fighting each other. It was Spartan allies fighting Athenian allies, and then the bigger powers get involved. So I think you see that played out
Yeah,
with Balkan wars. You
exactly.
see these smaller allies fighting each other, and then it escalates into the
That
major powers.
drags in like the big dogs.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, we can see that in our own time. There's lots of little countries that are
Yeah,
sort of engaged in conflict compared to the major empires, so to speak, or major countries.
absolutely. In fact, it's kind of worrying, like some ways where we're headed, even to today with the kind of conflicts and alliances we have, and it's a little precarious, man. It's
It's almost as if Thucydides could have predicted it over 2,000 years ago.
history does tend to repeat itself, and sometimes if you're not aware of that enough or not paying attention, could slip up.
Yeah. So that's why it's important to study these things because maybe we could glean things, we could learn
Absolutely.
from these events. We could have learned from Thucydides 2,000 years ago to prevent the incursions of World War One. But yeah,
I
here we are
suppose,
still
yeah.
learning, and that's the point of this podcast, right? To try to keep on learning and spreading the word.
Yep, that's what we're here for. Of course, if anyone wants, has any requests for topics that, might be related to this or anything they think is interesting, let us know. We might actually kind of touching on the idea on the topic of Greek independence and against the Ottomans, we might do one on that and the various other kind of um, countries and societies that actually helped make that happen, the independence kind of movement. Might be a cool idea. Um,
Yeah, the idea
yeah,
is hopefully to get something up on the Greek War of Independence. We just briefly touched on it here, but a little bit more info into more modern Balkan history, because certainly we've touched on other Balkan history with other podcasts like the Bogomils and the Cathars and the Byzantine Empire. And
yeah, that's right. We did do the Bogomils. I forgot about that. That
indeed,
that does
indeed,
kind of touch on the area. Yeah,
Bogomils are big in the Balkans.
yeah.
Bogomilism.
The buggers.
Yeah, yeah, Gnosticism. Um,
Good stuff.
well, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Uh, and thanks to our listeners.
All right. See you guys next time.